Let's get to college football, where there's a new #1 in Brandon Marcello's college football power rankings this week. Miami, who's on a bye, got leapfrogged by a couple of Big Ten schools in Ohio State and Oregon. Ducks beating Penn State and State College, a battle of top 10 teams, while the reigning champs went into Husky Stadium and handled Washington. I'm Tommy Tran with Brandon Marcello, who puts those rankings together, and Danny Kanell from the Cover 3 podcast to offer his thoughts, agreements, disagreements, and all that good stuff. So there's always going to be some change. That is your right to have that in there. So take me through the shakeup, and more importantly, 1, 2, and 3, Brandon. Is that sort of a line of demarcation in terms of tiers when it comes to these top programs?
Not necessarily, but I moved Ohio State up to #1 just because they went on the road into a very tough environment where Washington had the second longest winning streak at home in the FBS, and they went in there and dominated the second half and ended up winning 24-6 against a Washington team that hadn't really played much of anybody, but had looked very impressive in doing so, especially offensively. And Ohio State's defense just continues this trek down the road where they have proven to be a top 5 unit. I thought that in week 1 against Texas, seeing them in person, and it's only been reinforced here the last several weeks. And to be only allowing an average of 5.5 points here going into week 6 is pretty remarkable. That offense also seems to be getting up to speed a little bit more, but dare I say, and we'll see, that this defense is just as good, maybe better in some spots, than it was last season. The same defense that, of course, last year really led them into that playoff as that offense started to really explode.
So I think there is a little bit of a separation between the top 3 teams and the rest of the field. Now, we might have to rewrite that script next week if Miami goes to Florida State and loses, but I think these 3 are head and shoulders above the rest of the field. I personally think Oregon is the best team in the country right now. And if you had Ohio State, Oregon play tomorrow, I would say I would take Oregon. But here's the good news for Buckeyes fans, who I'm sure are very upset because they don't take any criticism very lightly at all. It's almost like they're just kind of given baby steps for Julian Sand, their quarterback, which is great because they have the defense that allows them to do that. And if they want to go back-to-back, I think they're going to have to open up the offense a little bit more with Julian Sand so that he can improve some, that they trust him more, they can throw the ball downfield a little bit more down the season. But to me, Oregon going into Happy Valley and getting the win the way they did, first of all, jumping out to that 17-3 lead, then getting punched back in the face, and then coming up with a big defensive stop in that performance. Oregon's defense is maybe one of the units that we didn't anticipate being as good as they are. They might be better than the defense they had last year. And Dante Moore is the best quarterback that Dan Lanning has coached at Oregon. I think the results are on the field early already, and the upside is higher than it was with Dylan Gabriel or Bo Nix. Oregon is a team, I think right now, for my money, I think is the best team in the country.
All right, let's get to 4th on the power rankings, which is Ole Miss. They're 5-0. They had that win over LSU. Brandon, what did we learn about Lane Kiffin and his Rebels?
Yeah, that defense is pretty good, right? They've done a very good job throughout the season, and that's what Lane Kiffin's really focused on the last 3 years, is improving things defensively and offensively. What about the story of Trinidad Chambliss at quarterback? I know everybody thinks there's a quarterback controversy there. There's no quarterback controversy. Austin Simmons got hurt. Trinidad Chambliss came in these last few weeks and has performed exceptionally well. He also has that it factor, and I'm not going to try and define an intangible, but everybody on that roster responds better to Trinidad Chambliss than anybody else that I've been told. And you could see it on the field, the way they game through things. They work through their mistakes. They work through issues when they're losing a little bit of momentum. And how about Ole Miss holding on to the ball for the last 5 minutes plus, converting a couple of 4th downs to end up icing that game against an LSU defense that hadn't allowed more than 10 points offensively all year. And Ole Miss is able to score 24. Remarkable job there by Lane Kiffin, Ole Miss, and something that they've been slowly building. I thought last year was maybe the year they were going to break through, but this year the early season resolve and attention to detail is so much stronger than it was last year. Remember, they lost at home to Kentucky in a game you just went, where did that come from? This team seems more focused. They have some better leadership, especially at the quarterback spot with Chambliss coming in, who's a veteran guy. I think Ole Miss has the potential here to maybe, if things break their own way, we'll see, finally breaks that drought and for the first time ever makes the SEC championship game.
It would not surprise me at all. Chambliss has been probably the best story of college football so far, coming out of nowhere, Ferris State. I think the big difference is age. He's 23 years old. Austin Simmons is 19. You pair that with a very obvious, upgrade from an early season glimpse at Austin Simmons, who struggled with interceptions. Chambliss is taking care of the football better, and I think his run dimension has added something to Lane Kiffin's system that really puts teams on their heels. And the thing that's impressive for me, they found different ways to win. Against Arkansas, it was a little more of a shootout, needed to score more points. This one, the defense needed to step up, and they did. And the schedule, they have 2 road games at Georgia, at Oklahoma, that are a little bit tricky for them. Other than that, they're probably going to be favored. I think 10-2 is probably the worst case scenario for them. They look like they're headed for the SEC championship potentially, but definitely for the college football playoff.
Okay, let's get to Penn State, the loser of that top 10 matchup with Oregon. It was all set up for them at night, whiteout game to get the win. And then once again, James Franklin falls against an AP top 10 team. Now, I guess it's maybe more of a macro question, Brandon, when you're talking about the Nittany Lions. Like, how much more pressure is that Ohio State and Indiana game now, given their weak non-con and this latest loss, even if it was close?
Yeah, I mean, it does certainly put more pressure on them. But I think more than anything, what we learned in that game is that Penn State is going to be Penn State forever under James Franklin as far as what we've seen on the field. Penn State's recruiting's always been kind of a step below Ohio State and Michigan. And it just proved itself out on the field every single year. Every now and again, once every 5 to 6 years, they kind of break through and beat one of them, but they always stumble at some point. And James Franklin just can't beat a team that has better talent around them in depth, no matter the location, whether it's in Happy Valley for a whiteout, on the road, or in the playoff. It is what it is at this point, and to continue to give the benefit of the doubt to James Franklin and Penn State, despite everything statistically, analytically, telling you differently on paper, is pretty foolish at this point, because James Franklin just is not going to be able to get this type of program when they went all in this year to beat Ohio State and Michigan, make the Big Ten championship game and win it, and not to be able to win the game against Oregon early in the season. I think their hopes of winning a Big Ten title are down the tubes, and I'm not so sure they're going to be able to do so unless Michigan and Ohio State in the future, 2-3 years from now, end up faltering a little bit.
Yeah, you tackled James Franklin. I'll tackle Drew Aller, because he was a quarterback who has never played big on the biggest stages, and once again kind of crumbles under the pressure, under the magnitude. Maybe it's versus the competition. And you thought maybe it was going to be a breakout for him. It's a gorgeous touchdown pass, maybe the best throw of his entire career, but then in overtime gets a little bit locked into a receiver, throws a game-sealing interception to lose it for him. Overall in the night was pretty pedestrian. At some point, I just wonder if that's what Drew Aller is. You kind of said James Franklin. It is what he is. If this is what Drew Aller is, that's the ceiling. They're not going to get through and punch through and win a Big Ten championship. They're not going to win, make it past the Final Four of the college football playoff. I do think there's room for improvement. The defense played really good, but they have to have Drew Aller step up. And if he just continues not to do it, I don't know how you trust him.
Yeah, that was part of the
By the way, Danny, I was going to say, I want to add, Drew Aller threw one pass over 20 yards and through the air, and it was that touchdown pass. Penn State just doesn't want to stretch the field for whatever reason. I'm not a coach. I'm not a schemer or whatever. But that's been the thing with Drew Aller and that Penn State offense, no matter who the coordinator's been. They just don't like to stretch the field very much. And they weren't doing it until they were forced to late when they were down 14 points. And what did we get? Got a beautiful touchdown pass. They need to reconsider some things potentially there.
I was going to say that's part of the recipe, right? It was supposed to be Drew Aller and that schedule. Both have been tough for them thus far, even with what they've done so far this season. Let me just quickly follow up on why I brought up Ohio State and Indiana, because, guys, do we think the college football playoff is in danger for this team, given 2 or maybe 3 losses are now on the table, Brandon?
I don't know. I kind of get the feeling that Indiana's going to stumble here at some point. I really do. I just saw some. I mean, I know it's Iowa, but they kind of put you in the mud, and there's a team out there that could potentially put them in the mud in the Big Ten and make them kind of stub their toe a little bit. I think Penn State, to me, is still going to be a playoff team. Even with the schedule that's ahead, there's a lot of pressure on them and everything, but that defense, as Danny mentioned, has been very exceptional. And offensively, they're going to be good enough. It's just that Penn State's not good enough to beat one of the top 3 or 4 teams in the country.
I think this is going to be a fascinating debate, and it's not going to be just Penn State. There are a lot of teams that are going to be stacked up at 10-2 and 9-3. And the one thing that we've heard about this enhanced strength of schedule metric with their non-conference, which was a joke, I do wonder if Indiana, they better be rooting for Indiana not to slip up again, because they're going to need a top 15 win if they do lose to Ohio State. I think that gets a little bit dicey. So while I thought, Penn State was going to be 11-1, if they're 10-2 and they lost to the two best teams on their schedule, I do wonder if the committee looks at them and says, well, who have you beaten? And that's a question that you don't want to be sit there having the committee asking, especially with some of the new metrics they're supposed to be considering.
Let's end with Danny's Knowles. Florida State losing that Friday night game against UVA. Take me through the Florida State aspect of this, Brandon.
Well, listen, their offense is still number one in the country. They can move the ball against anybody, but defensively, it's just as simple as wrapping up in the missed tackles against Virginia. Let's also give Virginia a lot of credit. That offense came into the game in the top 10. They looked like a top 10 unit after that game, despite some of those weaknesses. And I think Florida State, we saw some of those things that maybe we didn't necessarily notice in the first few weeks kind of pop up. I remember talking to some coaches after they beat Alabama, and they're saying there were some glaring holes for us defensively that Alabama wasn't quite able to exploit that we got away with, and those popped up when you watch the Virginia game. Having said that, they got such an amazing offense that they're going to be just fine going down the stretch here. And defensively, you just got to see them correct some of those mistakes, get a little bit stronger, and just improve on some of those fundamentals, wrapping up and tackling, for example. I think Florida State's just fine, but they deserved a tumble, losing to a team that, yes, they had a great offense, but their defense has left a little bit more to be desired.
Totally agree, Brandon. I was going to, pound the table and be furious, but Florida State has an opportunity, and they better turn this thing around fast with Miami coming to Tallahassee this weekend. If they beat the Hurricanes, then you can start pounding the table and say, hey, why aren't they closer to Alabama in the rankings, in the power rankings that are out there? Totally agree with Brandon's point. The offense, not too worried about, came out, and if you let a lesser opponent at home hang around with sloppy penalties and turnovers, that's how upsets happen. So it was sort of the perfect recipe for a disaster for Florida State. The one good news is against Miami, the thing that killed him was Chandler Morris with his legs. Every time he kept it off those RPOs, Florida State was completely caught guessing. They guessed wrong, and it burned them. This weekend, you get Carson Beck in the pocket. Wonder if that makes a difference. Plus, the home crowd should be an advantage for Florida State. But they absolutely are still. I don't think it's time to panic yet for the Seminoles. They can still achieve everything they wanted to in the preseason. So I think it's something to keep an eye out for this Saturday.
DK, Brandon, guys, certainly appreciate it. You can catch Danny Kanell on the Cover 3 podcast with Chip Patterson, Tom Fornelli, and Bud Elliott. Scan the QR code. Speaking of that big game in Tallahassee, the Cover 3 podcast will be there.